And let me mute everybody too. And so as we know, we're just, if you have a question, comment, just feel free to interrupt at any time, unmute yourself to do that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we now start the cycle of Torah readings all over again. We had a very interesting Simchat Torah. It was certainly a most unusual celebration that we had. Can't imagine not being able to sing and dance with the Torahs, but watching BJ and their recording that I shared, and watching the Soferet, the woman scribe, teach about how a Torah is written, I think paled in comparison to the physical energy of singing and dancing with the Torah and actually seeing the Torah unrolled in our sanctuary. So halavai, next year we'll be able to do that together. So Bereisheet, starting the Torah cycle over again, there is so much about the first portion in the entire Torah to talk about in terms of assumptions that are made and lessons that the Torah wants to teach us about the origins of life and our relationship to God. So let's just read the first verse, and then I want to get into the description of the sixth day of creation and the challenge that that presents. So not hard to find in whatever Chumash you're using where Bereisheet begins. In the Eitz Chaim, it's on page 3. Why books don't start on page 1, I don't understand. But whatever it is, all sections of the Talmud also, every single tractate starts with page 2. Not sure why the pagination in the for the Talmud doesn't start with page 1, but the first page of the Talmud is page 2. So I don't get that, but that's a discussion for another time. So the very first verse of the Torah, Bereisheet bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. So even the translation is difficult here. Because we're used to the Old English, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. But Bereisheet, so there would be, Reisheet is the first, or the start, or the beginning. So Bereisheet could be more technically translated at the beginning, or at the beginning of. So the syntax isn't great, but let's not focus on that for now. Bereisheet bara Elohim. So at the beginning of, God created. So you see that there's a problem with the grammar, but at the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So the fascinating thing here is that the Torah assumes from the very beginning that God exists. And as opposed to other cultures, Greek, Roman mythology, which has stories about how the gods themselves came into being, and also, if we don't want to go to Greek and Roman, so Greek mythology, we're talking about, I don't know, 2,200 years ago, maybe, no, 2,800 years ago, something like that. That still is after supposedly the time of the Torah. So it'd be more appropriate to look at ancient Sumerian myths, which if you can Google that on your own, ancient Sumerian, S-U-M-E-R, Sumer. If you Google Sumerian mythology, you will find there also a history of the gods. Like, so when a mythology of how the world was created and how the gods came into being. So what sets the Torah apart, just from a purely myth standpoint, if you wanted to compare the origin myth of the Jewish people to the origin myth of the Sumerians or the Babylonians or the Greeks or the Romans, one stark difference is that our story already assumes or comes from a place where God already exists. So God predates the story of the creation of our world, and God, therefore, the assumption is, from just by reading this, is that God is eternal and perhaps even dwells apart from our world. So those are important points that the Torah, just by straight reading, like we take it for granted. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. But you got to stop and understand the implication of God already being there, and that we have a sense also. So the story is also written from our perspective, that we already know what heaven and earth is. So Shamayim is technically sky. In modern Hebrew, the word Shamayim is sky, but it's also heaven. So it's something that's beyond us. And it's interesting, the commentary points out about Ibn Ezra, a medieval commentator who lived in Spain around 900 years ago. Already, scientists knew in Ibn Ezra's time that there was an atmosphere that beyond up above us, that kind of is like a layer that surrounds the globe. Whatever astronomers or scientists in Ibn Ezra's time, 900 years ago, knew that there was such a thing as an atmosphere like that. So he suggests, well, just in that when we get to the word firmament, rakia, that it's the atmosphere that surrounds the earth. And Shamayim also in the Midrash comes from two, the Midrash suggests that it comes from two words, that it's a compound word from Aish, meaning fire, and Mayim, meaning water. So that Shamayim is the combination of Aish, Mayim, drop the aleph, it becomes Shamayim. So that's interesting. I can't tell you grammatically if that's correct, but it's a nice midrash that heaven is a combination of fire and water. That that rain comes from the heaven, from up there, and the sun is up there. And so for the rabbis who were 2,000 years ago, not knowing that the sun is millions of miles away, and not even knowing that concept that those things are out there and how far out there they are, they just say they're up in the sky, so that the heaven is a combination of the fire of the sun and the water of the rain that is in the clouds. So that's an interesting concept. Okay, what I wanted to get to, because there's so much that we could talk about, I wanted to spend a little bit on the fifth day of creation. So let's turn ahead to page 9, and it's chapter 1, verse 24. So actually, for context, let's go back to page 8 and look at the fifth day. Then what I wanted to do was look at the sixth day. Let's look at the fifth day just for context, verse 20, page 8. So chapter 1, verse 20. Vayomer Elohim yishritzu hamayim sheretz nefesh chaya. God said, so God is referred to in this chapter as Elohim, not Adonai, but Elohim. Vayomer Elohim, God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. and birds that fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures of everything that creep. So these sea monsters, it's it's just presented in the Torah as is. What these sea monsters are, don't know. Taninim. Okay, so we next see that word in the book of Exodus with the miracle games that Moses plays in front of Pharaoh. So his staff, Moses' staff, turns into a tanin, which is singular of taninim, and then Pharaoh's magicians turn their staffs into taninim, and then Moses' staff swallows all their staffs. So that word is taninim. So it's some kind of serpent as translated there. But here it's a sea monster. And again, there's midrash about what these sea monsters are, and this sounds more mythological when we get when you have that kind of reference. But we have other references to sea monsters in the book of Job, in Isaiah, and in Psalms, but they're only very, very brief references. And based on those references, you get an idea from the Midrash about the names of these sea monsters and what their role was, and a sense that an ancient story was that God had to subdue these sea monsters in order to make the world inhabitable for us human beings and other creatures. So here is a hint of an ancient oral tradition of these sea monsters. So if you want, Google Jewish sea monsters, and you'll see, Leviathan, this huge whale-like creature, and other creatures like that are referenced elsewhere in Jewish tradition, if you're into that kind of stuff. Here it's just a side comment. And again, I don't want to focus any more time on that. I just want us to see how a day of creation is worded. God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fertile and increase, fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Okay, so clearly God is doing the creating. God talks and things are created, or God does and things are created. Okay, so that's how it worked on the fifth day, fourth day, third day, second day, first day. Sixth day, we're going to see something a little different. God said, verse 24, let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts of everything, of every kind. And it was so. So far, so good. The same as it has always been. Verse 25, now. God made wild beasts of every kind and cattle of every kind and all kinds of creeping things of the earth, and God saw that this was good. 26, and God said, Vayomer Elohim, Na'aseh Adam betzalmenu, ki dmutenu. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. So, what do you see there? Do you see an issue with the wording? And if so, what's the issue?
Us.
Yes, Saul, us. It's plural. Everything else before, it's just God saying to God's self, or just God talking out loud. Here, God is talking to other things. So we don't know what those other things. Why is God talking in the plural? God said, let us make man. Who's the us that God's talking to? Jan.
Angels.
Oh, Saul. Could be the angels. Jan, what were you going to say?
What I'm curious about is in this segment, you said that God is referred to as Elohim.
Yeah.
And doesn't that have an ending similar to other words?
Yes, it's a plural word. No, you're right. It's a plural word. So that's, yes. So that could be a hint to the plural that's in this day, but the plural of God's name is still the singular. So in other words, Elohim is a plural word, but the verb that goes with it is singular. Okay, so it says Vayomer Elohim. It doesn't say Vayomru Elohim. It's always Vayomer Elohim. So that's why Elohim is taken to be the singular, because the verb that goes with it is singular. Okay, so as we all know from English, noun and verb has to match, and tense has to match also. So, there are words that seem to be in the plural form that can be understood both in singular and plural, like chaim, life. Life is the word for life in Hebrew, l'chaim. Chaim is a plural sounding word, but it can be used both in singular and plural. Mayim, water, is another word like that. I'm sure there are a couple other words, but those are the two that come to mind right away. Sometimes in Hebrew, you can use a word in the singular to mean the plural. Like if you're saying, how old are you in Hebrew? Ben kama ata, if you're talking to a man or a boy. Ani ben 13 shana. I am 13 years old, not 13 shanim, which should be, but it's 13 shana. So sometimes you can use a word in the singular when it means plural. Okay, so Elohim, just the fact that it's a plural word doesn't necessarily mean it's plural. Okay, a discussion about the word Elohim and why it is that way, to refer to God, our God, in the monotheistic God. Why that happened, that I don't know. But despite all of that, God is talking, just God talking the first 5 days, singular, or just by God's self. Here, it's plural. So, Vayomer Elohim, God, Vayomer, in the singular. God said, Na'aseh, we will do, or we will make. Now, it should be, if it's singular, an aleph, A'aseh, I will make Adam B'Tsalmi, in my image. Okay, so clearly by doing Na'aseh, the nun always means the future plural. Let us, or we will make Adam B'Tsalmeinu. Nu is always the plural ending, which is short for the word anachnu, which means we. So when you have nu at the end of a word, it means our. And ki demutenu, like our image, demut, right? And then verse 27, vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzalmo. But then, so God says, let's do this in the plural. Let us do this. And then verse 27, God created man in his image. So then it goes to the singular. So in other words, he's saying in 26 to a group of whatever, we don't know, let us do this. And then in 27, God does it. So it should have said, Vayivra'u. No, Vayivra Elohim et Adam B'Tzal Mehem, in their image. Because he's asking, let B'Tzalmeinu, in our image. But then he created him in his image. So why switching from the our to the my? Yes, Elizabeth, unmute yourself. You can just go to your picture. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's
Still
okay.
figuring out this new device.
Yeah.
Um, could it be? Oh, there's two things that come to mind. One is sort of like kingly speech, like how
Yes.
queen or the king says,
Right.
let us, we at an hour, when they're really speaking about themselves, is one. The other
Yes.
thing that comes to mind is, could he possibly be involving all the creatures he created?
Okay. Good.
Conversation,
Good.
you know, let us do this now,
Right.
and but then that doesn't explain our image,
Oh,
because
so, okay.
image
So,
of, unless maybe it just means a created thing, an image in that sense. I don't know.
so that's okay. So these are two good ideas that you're raising that are not unique to you. They have been raised as possibilities throughout the centuries. So there, some suggest that it's the royal we that is common for royalty to speak in the plural like that. Um, and the other possibility is that, among other possibilities, is that God could have been involving creation, all the creatures that were created to this point, in the process of creating this new creature, the human being. So that, and that the homiletically, midrashically, that means that we, human beings, that is, are a product of all other creatures on earth. And that's a powerful thing, especially when we're told that we're supposed to be stewards of the earth. If we have a bit of everything else on earth in us, then we are invested in making sure that all creation is taken care of, because we are the embodiment of all creation. So there are those who suggest that that's what the reading is, and it's a powerful reading, especially for those who are active environmentally and about not just about the caring for the earth itself, but in terms of climate change and all that. So yes, anybody who cares about the environment would like that reading, that we as human beings are the embodiment of all of God's creation, and that we have an image of all of creation in us as a human being. So that is a way, but still, like you're suggesting, these are just possible explanations for this very troubling or provocative use of Hebrew, because later in the Bible, when prophets have their vision or their call to prophecy, some of the prophets in their call to prophecy see God's heavenly court. So you just look at Ezekiel, or you look at Isaiah, and Ezekiel's vision of the heavenly chariot, which we discussed back on Shavuot when we looked at that, because that's the Haftarah for the first day of Shavuot. There is this chariot, this vehicle that has angels all around it, and God's throne is on top of it. So that in Ezekiel's vision, there are these mystical, unusual beings that are in God's presence. And Isaiah sees bizarre creatures, seraphim and ophanim. So if we just translate those, because our prayer book, the Lev Shalem, doesn't translate those words. It went in the Hebrew, when they're in the prayer book, in the liturgy, those words are translated as seraphim and ophanim. So seraph is a burning creature, and ophan, well, all we know about ophan is that the Hebrew word for bicycle is ophanayim. So some kind of wheeled creature, whatever that means. So whatever, Isaiah sees these seraphim and ophanim calling out to each other in the great hall of God's court, and they're saying, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot. back and forth to each other. So there are visions from Isaiah and Ezekiel which prompt the rabbis then to expand on that and develop a whole system of angels. Who are these angels? How are they formed, and what is their purpose in the heaven and on earth? So from later Bible, we have a sense that there is a heavenly court around God, but we don't have that yet. Chapter 1 isn't telling us about that. So in other words, there are assumptions in chapter 1. So are we supposed to assume when God says in the plural in verse 26 that what we read later in the Bible about God's heavenly court applies here? It's possible, because the entire Jewish Bible is supposed to be seen as one unit. So even though there are separate books and clearly defined separate literary styles in all of the books of the Jewish Bible, as a unit, as the rabbis created the Bible in the form that we have it today, they were intentionally saying all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible are comprise one unit. So then it would be fair to say that the heavenly court that the prophets envision existed here in chapter 1, and that's what God's talking about. So if we look below the line, let's see what the Eitayim says about it. Let us make man in our image, there on page 9 below the line. Commentators in every generation have puzzled over the plural language in this verse. The Midrash envisions God consulting with the angels, perhaps hinting at a measure of divine ambivalence about whether human beings should be created. So that's a fascinating set of Midrash, that God is actually asking the angels, should I, God, create human beings? Just like there's Midrash about whether God should give the Torah to the Jewish people. So the angels argue about that too. So anything that we're given, there are midrashim about God consulting the angels about it, and so here the commentary is providing us just a taste of that. Truth and peace, the angels of truth and peace, oppose creating humans on the grounds that such creatures would surely be deceitful and contentious, right? These human beings are going to lie, so that's what truth argues against. And peace, human beings are going to fight each other, and that's what peace argues against. So they argue saying, well, these human beings are not going to be truthful and peaceful, so why bother creating them? Love and righteousness favor their creation, for without humanity, how can there be love and righteousness in the world? Right? Because animals don't know about justice. They just know about instinct. And animals don't know about love. They just know about instinct. So if you want to have love and righteousness in the world, then you need to have human beings, despite the fact that we're imperfect. So it's just interesting that the rabbis kind of twist things and use a little hint in the text of the plural here to create this whole value lesson about the purpose of human creation and what our role in the world is. So though the Torah says our role in the world is to be stewards of the earth, to be fruitful and multiply, and to have dominion over the earth, that's what the Torah says right here. The Midrash says it's more than that. We have to embody certain values, that we have to embody love, righteousness, and try to pursue truth and peace. Yes, Saul.
Okay, so when God creates man in his image, is that just a physical, or does that include all the traits? And if it includes the traits, later on, God tells the Jews, the Jewish people, how to he's going to create a war, and he's going to, slay all these people. Did God, I know this is a big question, but did God take those aspects from man, or Was that always in God?
Right. So it's a powerful question, Saul, that gets to the idea what came first, God or people. So in other words, is God narrating this story here to describe actually what happened at the creation of the world? Or is it or is the story a human creation describing what human beings think happened at the beginning of the world? So the second one that I am suggesting could be seen in some Jewish circles as blasphemous, to suggest that people wrote the Torah and put their perspectives into it might not is certainly not the traditional perspective, but I would argue it's not blasphemous. It helps. Either way, you got a problem. If God narrated a whole story, then you got a problem with God, how God's behavior in the Bible. Because why would God want Egyptians to die for Israelites to go free? God, in God's infinite power, could have found some other way for the Israelites to go free from Egypt without having to kill Egyptians to do it. So you got that dilemma, plus others, like God commanding us to go to war. So you have those problems if God wrote the entire Torah. And then from the human perspective, you got the main problem of, well, is God independent of the Bible? And when was God, does God exist without human beings? In other words, if humans wrote the story from a perspective on how to understand the world, which could possibly lead to the idea that God is a human creation, that is majorly problematic. So either way, humans wrote the Torah, God wrote the Torah, you have major theological implications and challenges that need to be overcome. The bottom line then is, which makes the more sense for things that we do Jewishly today, and what makes more sense for us trying to live a religious lifestyle. So for some, it might make sense that God wrote the entire Torah despite the challenges that ensues. And for others, it makes sense that people created God and created the Torah despite the theological challenges that ensue. I tend for the human creation of the story, and even the human creation of God, just theologically and religiously, that just makes more sense for me personally. But either one can be argued either way. It also, with human creation of the story and the Torah and of God, also lends itself to interpreting the role of Jewish law and how much more Jewish law as an evolving process, because humans created Jewish law, therefore Jewish law is constantly evolving and changing. If God wrote the Torah, then God wrote Jewish law, and therefore Jewish law doesn't change because God wrote Jewish law. So for me, the Jewish law and the theology piece works better that humans created this whole thing. And so therefore it also helps to explain any problems or inconsistencies in a text, that you can just see it better as just a bad editing at some places in the Torah, because we have some God. So like God is referred to as Elohim in chapter 1. Why does it change in chapter 2, verse 4, to Adonai? Adonai Elohim. So verse 4, Ela toldot hashamayim v'haaretz behi bar'am. This is the history of the heaven and the earth as they were created. Biyom asot Adonai Elohim eretz v'shamayim. On the day that God Elohim, Adonai Elohim, made earth and heaven. So where does Adonai come from? or it's chapter 1, where does Elohim come from? Now, where does Adonai come from? So, so the easy answer is from the biblical scholars is that chapter 1 is the E source. Chapter 2 is the J source. J for Jehovah, E for Elohim, and that the Torah is J-E. And then you got the P, the priestly source, J-E-P. That's mainly the book of Leviticus, but other pieces here and there. And then D for Deuteronomy, which is a whole different source itself. So J, E, P, and D is one easy explanation for the different strands and sources in the Torah. So Saul, there's no answer to your question. It's just that because we don't know when the oldest Torah we have is 2,000 years old. And that's from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And clearly we have archaeological evidence that the temple existed, the first temple existed, but we don't have documentary evidence from the first temple period. In other words, we do have the priestly blessing from written on an amulet from the first temple period. So we know that the priestly blessing in the form that we have it today goes back to at least the first temple period. But it begs the question, how much further back does the Torah go? And how much of the Torah existed before that? Those questions remain unanswered. Will they be answered? It's possible, but it's unclear. So therefore, religious people are left with which came first, God or human beings? The chicken or the egg, God or human beings? And I would argue it doesn't matter. What matters is we have this text in front of us that has been interpreted by the rabbis 2,000 years ago, and it's their interpretations that are important to us because Judaism today is based on the rabbis 2,000 years ago, and it's still being interpreted by us today, and we are just as able, responsible, authorized to interpret as the rabbis were 2,000 years ago. And the more we see human involvement in the story, the more we can claim that we have the right to constantly interpret the text and allow it to evolve. And it allows us to challenge the text as well. I mean, people have challenged me on my sermon from Kol Nidre, my anti-racism sermon. People have challenged me when I said in that sermon that the Torah is racist. When I pointed out the commandment in the Torah to the Israelites, and when they settle the land of Israel, they need to annihilate the indigenous population because they are different. Their ways are different. Their ways are an abomination. I argue that that can be seen as a racist perspective. Clearly, it raised hackles in some people, and that was my purpose entirely. But only to point out that the rabbis had a problem with the way the Torah sees others being non-Israelites. And that's why the rabbis made it a point in several places in rabbinic literature to point out that we're all created in God's image and the fact that we all look different shows the power of God to create so many different looking human beings out of the one image that God created us with. Joe.
Back to 124, or actually 26, where
the plural.
It says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, etc. Right. When I was back in college a million years ago, we talked about, there was a historian, Arnold Toynbee, not a great fan of the Jews,
right,
who said that this one passage is the origin of pollution.
Oh.
This is the origin that people felt that they had a right in ruling to do whatever they wanted to God's
Yes.
Okay, and so then there's the opposite that says, no, we were meant to be custodians.
Right.
Okay, so it's in terms of that one word.
Yeah, vayirdu. Yes.
Is this a Jewish word? Or, I mean, this is not, was this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or is this known to be a Jewish word instead of, like, you know, the mistranslations with the King James Bible in 1610? Is this a Jewish word?
Yeah.
And what does it mean? Which does it mean?
Okay, I'm going to look it up. I'm moving to my shelf. And I just want to share other translations of the word. Okay, so first, vayirdu. So, and God said, let us make man in our image after they shall rule. So our Jewish Publication Society says vayirdu means to rule. So don't be confused, for those who know a little bit of Hebrew, that means go down. Le'raid or yardu means they went down. Yirdu is a different word. Okay, so it's resh daled hey is the root. So before I go to the biblical dictionary, let me see what Robert Alter, how he translates it. I have an older, just his translation of 5 books of Moses. He recently came out with, and he had been working, he's a professor at University of California, Berkeley, noted English professor, but then spent a lot of time on the Jewish Bible, translating the Bible, etc. So he just completed an entire set of the translation of the entire Jewish Bible. So I highly recommend it. So here's how he translates this word. Just a second. Here's a lengthy introduction. Okay. He says it means hold sway. So our translation says, they shall rule the fish of the sea. God said, let us make a human in our image by our likeness to hold sway over the fish of the sea. Hold sway. So here, this is what he says in his commentary, Alter. Hold sway, the verb radah is not the normal Hebrew word for rule. The latter is reflected in dominion of verse 16. What word is he? Limshol, yes. Memshelet. Memshala is government. Limshol is to govern. So you have that back in verse 18 on page 8, the top of the page in Eitz Chaim. So there it means to govern. And so that's for the sun and the moon to govern the day and night skies. Here, human beings, they're not governing the animals, fish, and birds. They're redu, hold sway. And in most of the contexts in which it occurs, it seems to suggest an absolute or even fierce exercise of mastery. That's what Alter says that word is. There's another translator, Everett Fox, who's a professor at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He has a translation of the Torah also. And what he says this means is have dominion. So he doesn't have a comment on that dominion. So the biblical dictionary, I'm not holding out much hope for it. Let's see if I can find it by looking up the root, and I might not be so successful. Okay, so he says, it has it, Reish Daled Hey, just what the page of the dictionary looks like, have dominion, rule, or dominate. So, yes, so Joe, I would say here, yes, there are many people, industrialists mainly, who have said, well, this verse gives us, well, it certainly gives us the opportunity to eat and consume creation, right? That we can slaughter animals and birds and fish and eat them based on this verse. And we can use them and take advantage of them for our purposes. You could certainly understand that. The idea that we should be stewards of the earth probably comes from chapter 2, when we're told that we have it's taught in a slightly different way, that we're supposed to work with creation as opposed to totally dominate creation. So there are other references in the Torah to our role with other creatures, but yes, so that it's totally acceptable that it means to be in total control of and take advantage of creation. But let me finish with the plural here and what it says below the line. Or perhaps, so on the right-hand side below the line, to continue the let us make man in our image discussion, or perhaps God was speaking to the animals. So instead of speaking to the angels, which the first paragraph suggested, maybe God's speaking to the animals like Elizabeth suggested. Together, let us fashion a unique creature in our image, yours and mine, a creature like an animal in some ways, needing to eat, to sleep, to mate, and like God in some ways, capable of compassion, creativity, morality, and self-consciousness. Let the divine qualities manifest themselves in this culmination of the evolutionary process. And Albo, a medieval Jewish philosopher, sees each animal species contributing its choicest quality to this new creature. And we'd have to see his book to see, what the lion gave, what the donkey gave, things like that. So, but the idea is that we're a combination. Let us make God in our image. Let us make man, capital M, in our image means that we're both not just have elements of all of creation in us, but we have element of God in us too. Okay, so we see just by looking at just this one section how much we can talk about it. And the I just want to see from chapter 2, which has a slight different take on how people were created. I just want to see if it says anything about it. One second. So, if we turn ahead to page 16, which is chapter 2, verse 18, the Lord God said, it's not good for man to be alone. I'll make a fitting helper for him. And the Lord God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that would be its name. Okay, so there's a whole lengthy scholarly debate about what we learned from chapter 1, right? That human beings are created last. And here in chapter 2, where it seems human beings are created before the animals, birds, and fish were, and they came before man to be named. So why is that? What are these? How do we understand these different stories? And the man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to all the wild beasts, but for Adam, no fitting helper was found. So the Lord God cast a deep sleep upon the man, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at the spot. And the Lord God fashioned the rib that he had taken from the man into a woman, and he brought her to the man. Then the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman. From her was she taken. Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so that they become one flesh. Chapter 2 presents the story in a slightly different way and gives a reason for, like, what's the history of men and women cleaving to each other? Oh, it's from this story. So it's just, there isn't anything here about dominion over the earth, but it's possible that no, I was looking at the end of the Garden of Eden story. Yeah, nope, it doesn't say it there. So, the idea of being stewards of the earth versus having dominion is probably, Joe, a later, more modern approach to understanding caring for the world, as opposed to the old-fashioned industrialist approach. Saul.
So here's an easy question. That last thing you read,
Yeah.
How does the law committee interpret this with respect to a man wanting to cleave to a man and a woman wanting to cleave to a woman?
Oh, right. Yeah. So the law, so it's not just the law committee. You should know that an Orthodox rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Benny Lau, who's the nephew of the chief rabbi of Israel, is a progressive Orthodox rabbi and thinker, and is someone who's very much involved in progressive Orthodox thought, has came out a couple of days ago with a ruling about homosexual couples should have a place in the community, and that their lifestyle is legitimate. I am paraphrasing and oversimplifying, but just look for an article or what Rabbi Benny Lau said. So it's not just the law committee and the conservative movement, but it's also in the Orthodox world too, let alone Reconstructionist and Reform Judaism too. So first of all, when you understand Jewish law and the evolution of Jewish law, you have to the mindset is that you look to the Torah for a guide for values, and you look for the rabbis in the Mishnah and the Talmud for their take on these values. So when you have a value in the Torah that might be outdated, so this is obviously a heterosexual approach, which even in today's world is the more common way for men and women to interact with each other, that at least 80% of society is heterosexual, if not 90%. Okay, so I don't know what the figures are. I think homosexuality is 10% of the population. So if 90% of the population, it makes sense that a story would be written for the 90%, not for the 10%. So that's one way to understand this, right? That it's more common for men and women to cleave to each other than men to men or women to women. So it doesn't deny the fact that there could be, it's just possibly just reflecting the majority of society. But the harder one is in the book of Leviticus, which says when a man lies with a man in a manner of lying with a woman, that is an abomination. That's really the key statement that the law committee of the conservative movement had to deal with. And so what they decided to, their tact was to use another value from the Talmud, and that is kavod habriot, and that is human dignity. And they have examples from the Talmud of things that we need, that laws that can be changed because of human dignity. And I won't go into all of that, but the idea is when it comes to, it's happening today as we speak, as senators are grilling Amy Barrett and anytime senators interview a nominee for the Supreme Court, the conversation is always about legal philosophy and their take on interpreting the Constitution. So are you an originalist? That is, read the Constitution word for word, literally as it was written 200 years ago? Or do you interpret the words and see it as a document written 200 years ago that we, justices, Congress, the president, have the right to keep on interpreting? So that legal take also applies to the law committee, to rabbis, and understanding the Torah. Do we have to take it literally, or do we understand that it's an evolving, that humanity is evolving, values evolve, and therefore we can still fit in? So if there's a concept in Jewish tradition and Jewish law about human dignity that we can apply to understanding homosexuality, then let's do that instead of having, so that it wouldn't seem like we're abrogating the Torah, but we're within the system. So that's how that is done, just in a nutshell. So let's we'll end our conversation on the Torah today. Next week, the book of Genesis will give us lots of food for thought and comment with the stories that it contains. And so next week is the portion Noah, trying to understand what that whole idea, why would God, who creates the earth, as we see here, is going to destroy the whole, all of creation in next week's portion. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Stay safe and healthy. We have Minyan this evening at 7:30 and Minyan tomorrow at 8:45 in the morning and also 7:30 in the evening. We'll be able to extend our condolences to Paul Tillis tonight and tomorrow. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Have a good day.
Hi, everybody.
Have a good day.